Hello and welcome back. I will look to our court reporter. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I need 1 second here. I have a little technical problem.
No problem. Just let me know.
Okay, I'm ready to go. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you very much. I will go ahead and get started and reorient us. It is the afternoon of March 10th, and I am Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. We are in the afternoon portion of our day, several days into the rebuttal portion of the hearing with respect to the proposed Sites Reservoir project. And before we broke for lunch, we heard a summary of direct rebuttal testimony from Mr. Schutz. And I was just going to hand things over to Mr. Ferguson to ask Mr. Schutz some questions. So I'll look to my team to please spotlight the appropriate people and we'll get started. All right, then with that, to you, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you. Mr. Schutz, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
In your rebuttal testimony, you reviewed the operations ITP diversion criteria, correct?
I did.
And you conclude in paragraph 20 of your testimony, which is on page 6, that sites consultant MBK provides inconsistent reporting of the potential diversions available to the project as between exhibits AHO 48 and sites 334R, correct?
I did.
And AHO 48 is a memorandum prepared by MBK regarding the potential interaction of sites reservoir diversions and VA flow assets, as well as an analysis of the change in delta outflow resulting from the site's project operations and VA flow assets, correct?
Yes.
And AHO 48 was prepared before the release of the operations ITP, correct?
Yes.
Sites 334R is a technical memorandum prepared by MBK regarding sites' potential diversions based on the ITP historical analysis, correct?
Yes.
And sites 334R was prepared after the release of the operations ITP. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
So I'm going to focus on table CSPA 101A on page 6.
Okay.
You compared the average annual diversions from the historical analysis as reported in AHO 48 and sites 334R, correct?
I did.
And the column labeled table 4 in table CSPA 101A
Yes.
appears to contain the values from AHO 48 table 2 rather than table 4. Did you Can you confirm that you meant to refer to AHO Table 2 and not Table 4? Excuse me. Can you confirm that you meant to refer to Table 2 and AHO 48 and not Table 4?
Uh, if you give me a second, I'll pull it up and confirm
Okay.
that.
I just want to make sure I'm asking you the questions about the right table. So,
Okay. That's correct.
okay. In paragraph 20, you state that you cannot find an explanation for the discrepancy between Table 2 and in AHO 48 and the historical analysis, which is shown in Table 9 of Sites 334R, correct?
Correct.
Is your understanding that the data in column 2 of your table CSPA 101A, which I understand you obtained from AHO 48, reflects potential diversions without face value demands?
Yes.
Is it your understanding that the data in columns 3 and 4 in CSPA 101A reflect potential diversions with face value demands?
After hearing Mr. Walker's testimony, I did come to understand that, yes.
Okay. Do you agree that the distinction between the analyses with and without face value demands would account for the alleged inconsistency you assert in paragraph 20 of your testimony?
It would account for some of it. However, I would also note that regardless of the fact that there were different, it was reported differently in the different technical memos, AHO 48 and sites 334-R. It wasn't clear from the narrative what Mr. Walker had done differently. It wasn't clear to me, at least, what Mr. Walker had done differently in the different reporting of the historical analysis potential diversions.
It sounds like you have clarity on what he did differently now. Is that correct?
I do.
Okay.
And I did not go back to review in any detail whether anything else had changed besides that, with or without face value, the face value options added.
Okay. I'm going to move to table C SPA 101B. That's on page 7. You present average annual VA flow additions used in comparison of the sites project potential average annual diversions, correct?
Correct.
And in the paragraph 21, where this table appears, you conclude that sites diversions would reduce purported VA flow additions, correct?
I do.
And my understanding is you've reviewed the rebuttal testimony of Ms. Bizzoni. Is that correct?
I have?
And can we bring up sites 395C, please? And then turn to page 12. Please scroll down. Great. Mr. Schutz, do you recall this section of Ms. Bazzoni's testimony addressing your case in chief testimony?
Yes, and it goes on to the following page.
Yes, let's turn to page 13, please. And scroll down so that we can see lines 16 to 18. And do you recall the exchange on cross-examination with Ms. Bazzoni about the text at lines 16 through 18?
I do.
And specifically, Ms. Bazzoni states that review of the annual reductions in delta outflow is uninformative to the question of how the project may interact with VA flow assets and affect delta outflow, correct?
That's what she said, and on cross-examination, we had an interchange regarding what the definition of interact was. And my understanding was that her definition was that there was not a direct, a direct temporal interaction. In other words, sites would not be diverting at the same time that the voluntary agreement flow addition or flow assets would be released. That was not what I was looking at. I was looking at over the course of the water year, whether what the delta was between VA purported flow additions and sites purported sites potential diversions.
And you understand that the VA flows are intended to provide benefits at certain times of the year during certain year types, correct?
Generally, yes.
Okay.
That is, generally, I believe that's an accurate statement. I understand what they're purported to do.
And is it your understanding that those VA flow assets are intended to be provided during the period, generally between the period of January and June in above normal, below normal, and dry years?
Yes. And more specifically, most generally in March to May.
Okay. And do you recall asking Ms. Bazzoni to calculate the percent reduction in VA flow additions in below normal water years from January to June based on, I think it's table 7 in AHO 48?
I don't specifically recall that. Was that during the case in chief, or was that during rebuttal?
I think during your cross-examination of Ms. Bazzoni, you asked her to calculate that reduction.
During my cross-examination in the case in chief phase or the rebuttal phase?
The rebuttal phase.
Okay. And could you repeat the question again, please?
Well, I'm just asking if you recall asking her to calculate that percentage reduction
I don't specifically recall it, but I wouldn't be surprised if I had said
Okay.
that.
Okay. Well, I believe in your case in chief testimony, you calculated a reduction of 65%. In below normal years. Excuse me. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in your case in chief testimony, you calculated a reduction in VA flow additions in percentage terms of 65% in below normal years, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And in above normal years, I suggested that the site's diversions would be greater than the purported VA flow additions.
You recall Ms. Bozzoni concluding that the reduction for the period of January through June was 63%?
I do.
Okay. And I believe you asked Ms. Bozzoni to confirm that these similarly calculated reductions reflect a trend in reductions. You recall that?
I do.
And you recall that Ms. Bozzoni did not confirm that it reflected a trend?
I don't believe she directly answered that. So I guess you could accurately say that she did not confirm.
Okay. Generally, during the period of January through June, in above normal, below normal, and dry years, is delta outflow relatively stable or can it go up and down?
Well, it can go up and down in any of those years. I would say, tends to be more stable in dry years than in above normal years. And generally stable at a fairly low volume. But again, you have rain events that make the outflow somewhat variable.
Because the VA flow, excuse me, because VA flows are intended to have seasonal benefits, do you agree that performing a comparison of VA flow additions to potential sites diversions on a seasonal basis is more informative than performing the comparison on an annual basis?
Would you define seasonal in that context, please?
Well, a period of months rather than over 12 months. A period of months less than 12.
um, uh, I
And more
think
specific, I would say the January through June period, if we're talking about VA flows.
I would agree that January through June is probably the most appropriate comparison period.
Okay.
So, for example, it would not be appropriate to include, for those purposes, the additions of water that sites would make in releasing water for export, for example, to project partners. It would also not be appropriate to consider some of the depletions that or the reductions in flow from other sources, from other reservoirs in the North State that are modeled to take place in the July through December period under the voluntary agreements without the sites project being considered.
Well, my understanding of your testimony is that you were focused on the potential reduction in VA flow additions associated with sites diversions, correct?
Correct.
And so my question to you was whether an analysis of the VA flow additions relative to sites diversions is more informative if it's conducted during that January through June timeframe than on an annual basis.
As a general rule, yes. I don't think that um, the changes either in sites releases or in releases from other reservoirs dramatically changes the eh, the consequence, or what you would see from looking at the January through June period.
Do you agree that as part of any seasonal analysis, for example, a January through June analysis of the potential for sites diversions to reduce VA flow additions, it would be necessary well, let me restate that. So as part of any seasonal analysis, attempting to demonstrate that sites diversions would reduce VA flow additions, do you agree it would be necessary to show that after accounting for existing diversions, that would be diversions other than sites, there's not water in the river other than the amount required by D1641 and the 2019 BIOPS and the VA flow additions?
Okay, I'm going to ask you to repeat that question, please.
As part of a seasonal analysis that's attempting to demonstrate that sites diversions would reduce VA flow additions, it would be necessary to show that after accounting for existing diversions, there's not water in the river other than the amount required by D1641, the 2019 BIOPS, and the VA flow additions.
I think it depends on what you're trying to actually compare. If you are looking at simply the degree to which VA flow additions, well, let me state it in the active sense, sites diversions offset VA flow additions, then I don't think, I think you could also consider unregulated water in the system. If you're looking more specifically at the net result on delta outflow, you would have to factor in the fact that you have unregulated water in the system. However, I will point out that for the purposes of the VA analysis in AHO 48, MBK made the assumption that there was a one-to-one relationship between sites diversions and delta outflow reductions. That was an assumption that they made, a simplifying assumption, and one that one would have to look at an operations model such as calcium, which has its own problems, in order to consider whether or not the site's diversions would actually reduce delta outflow. There's another factor that also has to be considered, and that is whether the VA flow additions actually translate into delta outflow. And that is a subject of considerable discussion and some controversy at the State Water Board. And it's kind of beyond the scope of this particular discussion.
Do you recall questions from Ms. Chester during the case in chief portion of this hearing about the VA flow baseline to which the VA flows are intended to be additive?
I remember something about that, but I don't remember the specific questions.
Is it your understanding that the VA flows are intended to be additive to a baseline of D1641 flows and 2019 buyout flows?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
It's also my understanding that some of us, including me, consider that to be a baseline that's already taken away some of the existing flows or some of the appropriate flows. And it sort of goes along the maxim of, if you want a discount, tell me first so I can raise the price.
Well, I'm going to return to my question because now that we're on the same page in terms of what the VA baseline is intended to be, I don't think I got an answer to my question. And
Which
I
is?
asked you, in order to, as part of any seasonal analysis, to demonstrate that sites diversions would reduce VA flow additions, it would be necessary to show that after accounting for existing diversions, there's not water in the river other than the amount required by D1641, the 2019 biops, and the quantity of the VA flow additions.
I'm sorry, it's a very long question, and I'm going to ask you to repeat it again because I want to make sure I fully understand it before I answer.
Is it possible to break down that question a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, I'll try. Your testimony, in your testimony, you conclude that sites diversions would reduce VA flow additions, correct?
Could reduce VA flow diversions, yes.
Okay. And VA flow additions are amounts of water added to the system through VA actions over and above that required by D1641 and the 2019 biops, correct?
That's correct.
So we think about the water that's in the river. There's going to be what's required by D1641, the 2019 biops, and then VA flows will be additive to those quantities, correct?
VA flows should also be additive to what other water is already in the river that's unregulated, not necessarily a requirement. I mean,
I'm asking you a question about the VA flows and the VA flow program. And you said, you gave me your understanding that the baseline for the VA flow additions are D1641 and 2019 buyout flows, correct?
That's the baseline, but I think we have a disagreement about what the VAs are purported to do. And I don't believe that even the VA parties think of that as a disagreement. The idea is that of the VAs, as I understand it, is that the water is supposed to be additive to whatever water is in the system. Now, what defines what must be in the system is D1641 and the 2019 BIOPS. But that doesn't mean that if there's already unregulated water in the system, for example, from some of the tributaries north of the Feather River, of the Sacramento River, some of the tributaries of the Sacramento River north of the Feather River, that the VAs can simply say, oh, look, there's more water in the system than there's required to be, and therefore we've met the VAs. That's not my understanding of what the VAs would do. My understanding of what the VAs would do would be to calculate all of the water in the system at any given moment, that's including that which is required and that which is not regulated, and add on top of that additional flow. That's my understanding of how the VAs are supposed to work.
Okay, well, I mean, we could go back to the transcript or look at the MOU, but my recollection is you reviewed the baseline that's at least stated in the MOU for the VAs. Do you recall that, going over that with Ms. Chester?
Yes, but I don't think we disagree about what the baseline for the VAs is. I think we disagree about how that's going to be implemented in practice.
Okay, well, I'm focused on your claim that there's going to be diversions by sites of VA additions. So I think we can put aside perhaps the other unregulated flow, and just focus on what's necessary to show whether sites would divert VA flow additions. And so I'm going to return one more time to my question and ask, assuming we're doing this on a seasonal basis, to demonstrate that sites would divert what the VA parties are putting into the system as VA flow additions, it's necessary to show that there's no other water in the river other than what's required by D1641 and the 2019 BIOPS, and the water that's put in the river by the VA flow parties. Isn't that necessary to show that sites would divert those VA flows?
I think the question is not whether sites would divert the VA flows on a one-to-one, as in, X water that was released would be directly diverted by sites. We're talking about volumes of water. The volume of water that sites diverts offsets the volume of water that is added by the VA flows. So if 2/3 of the volume is taken by sites, 2/3 of the volume of the purported addition, then it reduces the net increase provided by the VA flow additions. And they become not additions, you've subtracted something from them. Now, whether you want to have the semantic distinction, which is kind of, I think, what Ms. Bizzoni was getting at, that you're not actually diverting VA flows, you're diverting unregulated water, the net result becomes the same, that you're taking out a volume of water. And the VAs were the ones who purported to be adding water. So if you're taking water out.
Yeah, Mr. Schutz, I'm going to return one more time to your conclusion in paragraph 21. I mean, you state that this supports my statement that potential sites diversions would reduce purported VA flow additions from the voluntary agreement. So it's not focused on delta outflow. It's focused on the VA flow additions. And so that's why I'm asking you the question and trying to get to the bottom of
Okay, well, why don't
demonstrate sites would divert VA flows.
And Mr. Ferguson, if you could let him answer the full question, and I mean, or maybe direct it to the hearing officer, but it seems like right now you're arguing more than asking and interrupting his answer and then arguing with him about it.
Fair enough. I may have interrupted there. I'll return to my question then at the right time. Do you have more to say on that, Mr. Schutz?
Yes, if that's the specific thing you're looking at, I think it might be more clear to say that potential sites diversions that the volume of potential sites diversion would reduce the volume of purported VA flow additions from the proposed voluntary agreements. I'm not saying that there's a one-to-one interaction, as Ms. Bozzoni is sort of emphasizing. I'm saying that you're purporting to add a volume of water. Sites is subtracting a volume of water. The delta there is what I'm looking at.
In order to show that the sites diversions would subtract the VA volume of water, you would need to demonstrate there's no unregulated flow in the river, correct?
No, I don't agree.
Why not?
I just said that. Because the purported additions assume the presence of that volume of water which sites would otherwise divert. It's not additive simply to the regulatory requirements. It's purported to be additive to the water in the river. That includes the water that sites would potentially divert.
Are you aware of any document that reflects the characterization you just provided that the VA flows are purported to be in addition to all the flow in the river, regardless of required flows?
Yes, I think that's the understanding throughout the voluntary agreement document, the analysis of the voluntary agreements in the draft staff report, and in all the discussions of how you'd account for the additions. I think that's an assumption. The idea is that in order to do the accounting, the VA parties would model what would have been in the river absent the VAs, and then they will show that they added water to that, and that following that there will be a true up of some kind, either on a monthly or an annual basis, showing that they've actually added water. I think it's a problem with the entire accounting mechanism for the voluntary agreements, but I think that's the dilemma that the accounting for the voluntary agreement is confronting right now.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. In paragraph 28 of your testimony, Mr. Schutz, at page 10, you state that it's necessary to establish protocols to ensure that non-sites water is unrestricted by flow-dependent diversions and is not repurposed to storage in sites reservoir by existing canal users, correct?
I don't think you stated that quite right. What I'm saying is that diversions to the Tenayama-Colusa Canal and the Glen-Colusa Canal that are not limited by flow-dependent diversions must be accounted for separately and accurately as compared to sites diversions which are restricted by flow-dependent diversions. I don't know if that's different
Okay.
than what you said but I understood what you said to be different.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Did you review the reporting criteria for the sites authority that's stated in the operations ITP?
Probably did, but I don't recall it at this moment.
Okay, maybe we can bring up sites 298 and turn to page 44. Yeah, can we turn to page 44, please? And scroll down, please, to 9.13. Okay, thank you.
Just scroll down to the next page, please.
Yes, thank you. We go down further. Sorry, I meant to focus on 9.14. Thank you. So 9.14 begins this section on flow-dependent diversions, correct? And the related criteria.
Yes.
And can we go down to 9.16 and 9.17? It's page 49. There we go.
There you are.
So here's the 9.16 and 9.17 contain the reporting criteria for the authority for the Hamilton City and Red Bluff diversions, correct?
I see 9.16. Yes. Would you repeat the question? I believe I agree, but I need you to say it again.
Well, I'm
please.
just asking you, does 9.16 and 9.17 contain the authority? Does 9.16 and 9.17 contain the reporting requirements for diversions at the um, Hamilton City and Red Bluff?
Ms. Mullen, would you scroll down, please, so I could see 9.17 as well? Okay, slow down. Sorry. Conveyance reporting. I see that,
Okay.
and I did review this.
Is it your opinion that these reporting sections do not contain the accounting protocols that you suggest in paragraph 28?
It's a little different because what this describes is after the fact accounting. And what I was talking about was first being sure that the diversions to sites were appropriately limited by the flow dependent diversions. And I think those actually were in some of the like 9.14 and some of the earlier sections that we reviewed just now. But also on a real and sort of what I'm dealing with here is more on a real-time basis and less on the accounting, which under these sections is something that gets taken care of by August 15th annually. So after the fact. And then the other part is there is some of the site's partners are also member units of the Glen Calusa and or Tehama-Calusa Canal water users associations or authorities. And I might not have the terms right, but I think you understand what I mean. And there has to be clear demarcation of when water is diverted, for example, in the Glen Calusa Canal to, for example, and it's just an example, RD 108, for immediate use, and when it's diverted for storage in Sites Reservoir as part of RD 108's storage allocation in Sites Reservoir. And so that's what I'm talking about here, that there has to be a clear and transparent way of doing the accounting so that, and I'm not suggesting that this would be deliberate, but certainly that inadvertent or simply imprecise accounting for where the water is going doesn't, in some sense, in some way, violate the flow-dependent diversion requirements.
Well, do you agree that you would be able to review the data that's required by this reporting requirements, at least at the end of the year, to determine whether there's any discrepancies?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
This is not an accusation or a suggestion of nefarious intent. It's simply something that I think needs to be addressed in establishing protocols to make sure sites water and non-sites water are distinguished. One of the purposes of sites water as expressed is flexibility, and that must not include flexible exchanges isn't the right word, but moving between diversions to sites and non-diversion to sites without at least clear demarcation and accounting.
Well, you agree that these reporting requirements would require sites to show that it effectively complied with the flow-dependent diversion criteria, correct?
I do agree with that.
Okay.
I'm not questioning the whether, I'm questioning the how, or pointing out the need to define the how.
Okay. I'm going to move on to paragraph 29. And in paragraph 29, you state that the operations ITP condition of approval 9.9 appears to allow diversions from the Sacramento River when a temporary urgency change petition or order for the CVP or SWP is in effect, and a high flow event creates conditions that comply with the water quality control plan requirements, correct?
Yes, the water quality control plans not as modified by the TUCO.
Okay. Is it your understanding that under such a scenario, assuming sites were able to divert, the diversion criteria that the delta would need to be in excess condition would need to be met too, correct?
I do understand that.
Okay. And when I say excess condition, I'm referring to condition 9.8 in the operations ITP. Are you familiar with condition 9.8?
Not that specifically. I'm familiar with excess conditions as defined by the Coordinated Operations Agreement of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project.
Okay. So well, let's look at condition 9.8 just briefly. And yeah, to make sure we're on the same page there.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, that's in sites 298 at page 43. So yeah, I
Yes, I'm
should
familiar with
re-ask
this.
my question, Mr. Schutz. Is it your understanding that if sites were able to divert in the scenario that you described where there's a TUC order in effect,
Mhm.
and there's an event that would otherwise result in compliance with the D1641 requirements and allow for some level of diversion,
Mhm.
that this condition 9.8 would need to be met as well in order for sites to divert during such an event?
I do understand that. This particular requirement was changed from what sites had originally proposed. And in my view, it's less restrictive than what sites had originally proposed. And so I can foresee situations where there would be an atmospheric river or a small atmospheric river even that pushed the delta into excess conditions for a few days and allowed sites to divert for a few days, but that then the state and federal projects determined that they were not going to uh, effectively ask the water board to end their temporary urgency change order. And it's my view that um, in those circumstances, sites should not be allowed to divert on an episodic high flow event in the midst of a prolonged dry period.
Do you agree that the likelihood of the type of events you describe, um, along with the excess condition criteria 9.8 being met, are rare, or likely to be rare?
They're likely to be rare, but not unheard of. There are events that do take place in dry water years, and they tend to come, sort of all at once. And my perspective is that if they're rare, it should not be a great hardship for the site's authority to forego diversion under these circumstances which I point out in my testimony, uh, are particularly valuable to fish.
You mentioned that you believe condition 9.8 is less restrictive than the original, I'll call it excess conditions term that sites had proposed. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Have you done any sort of analysis of the um, relationship between either the conditions and fishery conditions, particularly salmonids?
between those specific conditions, the analysis that I offered in my testimony had to do with the importance of pulse flow events in the Sacramento River in dry years and their relative importance regarding as opposed to the importance of pulse flows as such in wetter water years. That was the only analysis that I offered regarding fisheries in my testimony, and it was based on Dr. Hastrick's paper, Dr. Hastrick being, for other purposes, one of the site's authorities witnesses.
Okay, so my understanding is you haven't assessed whether or how condition 9.8 or site's prior condition may or may not affect those the biological benefits of those pulse flows, correct?
No, I reviewed Mr. Walker's testimony, which suggested that condition 9.8 would allow somewhat greater volume of diversions over the period of record than the previous excess condition requirement that had been that was contained in the ITP application.
Beginning in paragraph 32, you state some concern about the authority proposing to leave diversion criteria to the discretion of CDFW and any subsequent ITP. Is that correct?
I do.
And my understanding is that your opinion is based on the quotations on page 12 by Ms. Forsyth. Is that correct?
Also on cross-examination as shown on page 12. Yes.
And my understanding of your concern is that the board's, I would say, potentially limited participation in any future operations IPT is based on the possibility that a future ITP would be less stringent than the current ITP. Is that correct?
Not entirely. I mean, it could be different, or there could be different restrictions that were different that may or may not be considered less stringent. But my ultimate concern is who the authority is and who makes the decision. And also the process by which that decision is made.
So if if future operations ITP criteria remain as stringent, it sounds like you still may have other concerns regarding this process of relying on the ITP for
Yes, I would have other concerns that have to do with who the decision maker is and what authority there is. Um, for example, since we're discussing TUCPs, any variances or changes either on a short-term or long-term basis that might be made and how they would be made. So it's not simply a question of whether it's more stringent or less stringent. I mentioned stringency as such because if in fact the water board placed requirements in a water right permit that limited sites diversions and the ITP, a subsequent ITP created more stringent diversions, it's likely, although not necessarily true, that nothing would need to be done regarding the water board's condition because the ITP condition would be additive.
With respect to, I guess, fishery and public trust issues and probably others, I mean, your understanding is that the state board retains jurisdiction over any permit issued to the authority, correct? And specifically jurisdiction to even potentially reopen a permit to address certain impacts to those resources, correct?
As a general matter, that's a condition of most water right permits, yes. That does not assuage my concern, however.
In paragraph 48, you identify a provision in the operations ITP, and this is of your testimony, so we can take this, the ITP down. You identify a provision, excuse me, that requires what you refer to as evaluating baseline conditions as part of the operations ITP, correct?
I do.
Do you agree that this requirement would contribute to the knowledge needed to determine the effects of sites diversions on migrating fish?
It would contribute.
Okay. Is it your opinion that the sites project should be able to define and address all effects of sites diversions on downstream fish at this stage in the project?
I don't think that's possible.
Okay. Okay. I don't have any further questions. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I do have one more question. I was on another piece of paper.
That's okay.
I think we covered it though. Well, we should just go real quickly. Can we bring up your PowerPoint presentation, which is CSPA 104C, and turn to page 4. I just want to make sure there's clarity in the record. on page 4, your last bullet, Mr. Schutz, refers to the delta excess condition that we were just looking at, I believe, which is 9.8, correct?
Mhm.
And you've mentioned that diversions are allowed once NDOI has been 3,000 CFS greater than excess for 3 days, correct?
I do.
But 9.8 doesn't have that 3-day requirement, correct?
I understood it too. Did I misunderstand? Could we look at 9.8, please?
Yeah, if we can bring up sites 298 and I believe it's page 43.
It may have come from somewhere else in this, and I don't recall. It may be an averaging period that's stated somewhere else.
Okay, but at least as far as you can tell, 9.8 doesn't contain that requirement, right?
As far as no, 9.8 does not contain that requirement. That's correct.
Okay. Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I will look to Mr. Soderlund. Do you have questions for Mr. Schutz?
Thank you.
Was that a no, thank you?
Yeah, I
Okay.
do not have questions.
Great. Ms. Mendel-Rice, do you have questions for Mr. Schutz?
I do not have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Mitchell?
I do not have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Then with that, Mr. Mooney, do you have redirect for Mr. Schutz? You're on mute.
Could we just have a short break and then I don't think I probably do, but I just wanted to double check.
Let's go ahead and take 5 minutes. We'll come back at 2 o'clock. Thanks. Reporter, are you ready for us to go back on the record?
Yes, I'm ready.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Mooney, do you have
And
redirect for Mr.
we do
Schutz?
not have any redirect, so we're ready to go to the next panel.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, thank you very much, Mr. Schutz. Thank you for your testimony, and you are excused from the witness stand.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, I believe next we have Dr. Rosenfield. Is that correct? And I see Mr. Busher, you are off mute. Does that mean you will be introducing Dr. Rosenfield?
Yes, correct all of that.
Excellent. And with that, welcome, Dr. Rosenfield. It's good to see you again. I will go ahead and re-administer the oath. I know it's been quite some time, so I will re-administer the oath and then we will continue from there. Will you please raise your right hand? Dr. Rosenfield, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Mr. Busher.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rosenfield, can you please state your name for the record?
Jonathan Rosenfield.
And you understand you're testifying under oath this afternoon?
Yes, I am.
Is Exhibit Baykeeper 132 a copy of your written testimony for this phase of this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
Did you prepare that testimony?
I did.
And then on the last page of that document at paragraphs 45 through 48, you describe 4 documents or excerpts of documents that are attached to your testimony are exhibits Baykeeper 128 to 131, true and correct copies of those documents or the identified excerpts from them.
Yes, they are.
And if you could please go ahead and briefly summarize your testimony.
Okay. Good afternoon. As I've stated in my previous oral and written testimony to this proceeding, numerous fish species in the San Francisco Bay watershed are in grave danger of extinction. Equivocation on this point by CITES experts is not consistent with the best available science, the law, or this water board's own repeated findings. Indeed, 7 fish populations that are unique to this watershed have been formally listed as threatened or endangered under state or federal endangered species acts. CISA defines endangered species as those that are in serious danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant portion of their range, and threatened species are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future in the absence of the special protection and management efforts afforded to listed species. Regardless of their formal designation, federal fish and wildlife agencies have recently determined that several species listed as threatened are in fact at high risk of extinction. This water board is on record stating that many of the native fish and wildlife species in the Bay Delta watershed are now on the verge of extinction. In addition to the endangered species, several fish populations that once supported thriving fisheries have declined to the point where fisheries are now closed or severely constrained. Beneficial uses of water in the Bay Delta, such as rare species, commercial and recreational fisheries, and water recreation, are jeopardized in large part by the unsustainable diversion of rivers that flow into and through the Delta. Again, failure to acknowledge this point is at odds with the best available science and the findings of this water board and other state and federal agencies. As recently as last year, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency stated, "Scientific consensus indicates that native fish populations' abundance is positively associated with flow volumes, and that large-scale increases in both flow and habitat restoration are needed to recover and protect these and other native species." In this proceeding, the Water Board is considering whether to allow the proposed CITES reservoir to divert water from the Sacramento River, the main source of fresh water for the Delta and San Francisco Bay ecosystems. To the extent that most of the flow viability relationships displayed by native fishes are continuous, and that more flow equals more fish, any diversions to CITES reservoir in the relevant season will harm fish and wildlife beneficial uses that the Water Board already acknowledges are not reasonably protected, And to the extent that fish, wildlife, and other beneficial uses are already not reasonably protected, any additional harm from sites diversions may be identified as unreasonable. Proponents argue that the negative effects of sites diversions to multiple fish species and water quality are, quote, small. But even if this were true, it does not mean that these impacts will not be biologically significant or even devastating. In fact, many of our native fish populations are particularly susceptible to any negative effect exactly because they already suffer from chronically low abundance and depressed survival rates. That small populations are disproportionately susceptible to environmental insults is axiomatic of modern conservation biology. It is important to point out that the reverse is not true. Small positive effects are not disproportionately beneficial to endangered populations, especially if those benefits are insufficient to reverse the population's decline. A related point is that statistical significance is not the standard by which we measure biological significance or reasonable protection. Statistics are intended to separate out trends from environmental or experimental, quote, noise. Beyond determining whether a relationship between variables is likely to be real, i.e., statistically significant, statistical methods are not very helpful for identifying whether negative effects are reasonable. We need other tools and standards to reach those conclusions. Previously, I testified that proposed sites operations would harm several native fish species, particularly those that are formally listed as threatened or endangered, and those for which the fishery is already constrained. CDFW's analysis of those operations supports my previous testimony. The incidental take permit describes several conditions that CDFW has determined are necessary to prevent sites operations from further endangering or extirpating the CISA-listed species. These conditions will not necessarily result in reasonable protection of fish and wildlife beneficial uses or the public trust because the ITP, A, does not avoid, minimize, or fully mitigate the harm from sites operations, B, does not cover non-CISA listed species at all, and C, are not intended or designed to provide, quote, reasonable protection for beneficial uses of water, such as recreation and or fisheries, which are the board's charge. As I stated previously, I do not support building or operating sites reservoir, as it will necessarily harm species and water quality and related beneficial uses that are already severely compromised. Under the ITP, fish, wildlife, and water quality will still experience negative effects. To summarize, the viability of many native fish species is already severely challenged. Because their abundance and population growth rates are extremely depressed, these populations are disproportionately sensitive to negative project effects. C, the consequences of the negative effects can be irreparable, and D, the status quo for many of these species is decline. As a result, even seemingly small negative effects that are projected from sites' reservoir operations must be regarded with great concern and minimized or avoided entirely. The only way to completely avoid these effects is to not divert water to sites' reservoir. And with that, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenfield. Mr. Hitchings, I see you're off mute. Do you have questions for Dr. Rosenfield?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Rosenfield. Again, my name's Andrew Hitchings and represent the Sites Project Authority in this proceeding. Thanks for being here today to answer our questions. Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up Dr. Rosenfield's rebuttal testimony at BK 132? And if you could go to page 3, please. Here at lines 1 to 3 of your rebuttal testimony, you discuss the State Water Board's 2010 Public Trust Flow Criteria Report, which is BK 96. And you quote language here in lines 1 to 3 from the third recital of the board's resolution approving the report. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Let's, if we could pull up BK 96, please, and go to PDF page 5. And if we could scroll down to the last 2 sentences of the first recital. And actually, maybe if you could scroll up a tiny bit so we can see that paragraph 1, numbered 1. Dr. Rosenfield, the last 2 sentences in the first recital here of the board's resolution state as follows. The purpose of the flow criteria report is to inform planning decisions for the Delta Plan and the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. The statute specifies that the flow criteria shall not predetermine any issue that may arise in the State Water Board's subsequent consideration of a permit. Do you see that language?
I do.
And do you agree with those statements?
Are you asking me what the Delta Reform Act says?
I'm asking you whether you agree with the content of those 2 sentences that I just read that are in the resolution.
I don't agree or disagree. If that's what the law says, then that's what it says.
Okay, at PDF page 14 to 15, if we could scroll to 14 at least to start, and if we could scroll down to the bottom if we could. And in the last section that starts on this page, it's entitled the State Water Board's Public Trust Responsibilities in this Proceeding.
Can you tell me where you are again?
On PDF page 14, this is what's pulled up. It's the last section with the header, the State Water Board's Public Trust Responsibilities in this Proceeding.
Got it.
Okay, so this continues on to the next page, but the first paragraph in that heading reads, under the public trust doctrine, the State Water Board must take the public trust into account in the planning and allocation of water resources and to protect public trust uses whenever feasible. And I'm not going to cite to the case citations. Public trust values include navigation, commerce, fisheries, recreation, scenic, and ecological values. And then, quote, in determining whether it is feasible to protect public trust values like fish and wildlife in a particular instance, the State Water Board must determine whether protection of those values or what level of protection is consistent with the public interest, citing to the State Water Board cases. The State Water Board does not make any determination regarding the feasibility of the public trust criteria and consistency with the public interest in this report. Do you agree with those statements in that first paragraph?
Objection, compound, and half of them at least call for a legal conclusion, maybe more.
So Mr. Hitchings, where are we going with this? I mean, I can read the document too, but.
Well, Dr. Rosenfield opines about what the public trust requires and what public interest requires, and he relies on this report in part to do that. I'm pointing out sections of the report that may address kind of a different viewpoint or a more nuanced viewpoint than what Dr. Rosenfield testified to.
All right, I'll allow it, but let's go through one by one. I think the compound was fair enough.
Well, how about if I just asked if you disagree with any of those statements?
Can we see the rest of the quote on the screen? I think you were quoting from something. Yeah. Again, this is the state board's statement about what the state board is doing. So I can't agree or disagree, but to get to your point, maybe this proceeding that we're in is not about setting water quality objectives, which is what this report is referring to. Sites Authority in their documents claims that sites diversions will be of excess and or surplus flows. And I invoked this document to say that, okay, flows greater than 75% of unimpaired delta outflow may be excess. But this report's scientific analysis, which is completely relevant here, says that flows, diversions of flow such that they fall below 75%, impair the ability to protect the public trust. That was the purpose of my reference to this document. I'm not drawing legal conclusions or advocating for 75% unimpaired flow objective in the water quality control plan here. I'm saying there's a new diversion proposed. It proposes to divert excess flows. So what does excess mean? And in this analysis, this very thorough analysis by the State Water Board, they found that flows below 75% of unimpaired are not excess and not surplus in terms of protecting public trust resources. Whether they consider it and choose to do something different is largely a legal matter. I'm analyzing the scientific basis for protecting flows and defining what is excess or surplus.
Okay, well, let's go to the next section on PDF page 15, because I think it goes to that issue you just raised. And you do reference in your testimony some of the caveats that are in this report. So the first two sentences under the heading future use of this report state none of the determinations in this report have regulatory or adjudicatory effect. Any process with regulatory or adjudicative effect must take place through the State Water Board's water quality control planning, water rights processes, or public trust proceedings in conformance with applicable law. Do you agree with those statements?
I think that's what we're doing right now. I agree. And I'm using this document in those processes as it was intended to be used.
And then at the top of page 16, if we could scroll there. The first full sentence there states the flow criteria in this report are not pre-decisional in regard to any State Water Board action. Do you agree with that statement?
Objection, legal conclusion as to pre-decisional under the statute.
Sustained. I think we should move on, Mr. Hitchings. I understand your point.
Well, let's go down to the summary determination section. And this is relevant to a line of questions that I have following this. So the third and fourth sentences in that section of the report state that the flow criteria represent a technical assessment only of flow and operational requirements that provide fishery protection under existing conditions. The flow criteria contained in this report do not represent flows that might be protective under other conditions. Do you disagree with those statements?
Yeah, I agree with those statements.
And do you agree that in general terms, the 2010 flow criteria report recognizes the need to incorporate the best available science that continues to be developed when making future determinations to provide fishery protections?
I agree, and much of the science that I'm aware of since 2010 strengthens the case for the importance of freshwater flow in protecting public trust resources and beneficial uses.
You referenced BK 59 later in your testimony in paragraphs 12 and 16 regarding the Wilkins slough bypass flow requirements, correct?
You'd have to remind me what those.
So BK 59 is the Michel et al. 2021 peer-reviewed and published study, correct?
I believe that's correct, yeah. I don't have these memorized by exhibit number.
And that study was published more than 10 years after the 2010 flow criteria report was adopted, correct?
Correct.
In issuing the operations ITP for the sites project, CDFW relied on the Michel et al. 2021 study in setting the Wilkins Slough bypass flow requirements in that ITP, correct?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, in issuing the operations ITP for sites, CDFW relied on the Michel et al. 2021 study in setting the Wilkins Slough bypass flow requirements in the ITP, correct?
That's correct.
And CDFW has determined that the Michel et al. 2021 study is currently the best available science for predicting juvenile Chinook salmon migration survival in the Sacramento River, correct?
No, not correct. Michel et al.
If we could pull up,
The Michel et
well-
al. 2021 paper covers survival of smolt-sized fish that are radio tagged in one reach of the river.
let's go
There are
to,
more recent
let's go to
studies.
sites.
There are more
Sorry, I
recent
thought you were
studies-
finished.
There are more recent studies that I cite in my testimony from upstream and downstream of where Michel et al. Did their study on similarly radio tagged fishes that have higher flows for different reaches of the river. So Michel et al. Is a fine study. It's of one piece of the river for one specific kind of fish.
If we could go to sites 300, we could pull that up and go to page, PDF page 327. And so there in the first whole paragraph there, the first sentence, and what I had asked you is whether CDFW had determined that that study is currently the best available science for the purpose stated. And here the first sentence says, the flow survival relationship described in Michel et al. 2021 is currently the best available science for predicting juvenile Chinook salmon migration survival in the Sacramento River. So do you agree that that is what CDFW has determined as reflected in that sentence?
That's what that sentence says. I believe that sentence is poorly worded.
If we could pull up BK 132 again, Dr. Rosenfield's rebuttal testimony. And on page 5, we could scroll to that, lines 3 to 6. Here you state, Dr. Rosenfield, in order to ensure that higher smolt survival rates are actually attained, I previously recommended that sites diversions be prohibited when flows are below 11,030 CFS at sites diversion points and Wilkins Slough. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if we could now pull up BK1, which is Dr. Rosenfield's case in chief testimony. And if we could scroll to page 26. Line 17 to 22. And as I understand it, Dr. Rosenfield, I think this is where that previous recommendation was included. And on those lines states, to be certain that the benefits of exceeding the flow threshold are realized, river flows must be managed to remain at or above the upper end of the error bound. In this case, flows of 11,030 CFS are the upper error bound for the threshold effect described by Michel et al. flows at or above this level are highly likely to produce 50.8% survival of smolts migrating through the relevant reach of the Sacramento River. Do you see that?
I see it.
And here you don't provide a specific citation in the Michel et al. Study or any other specific source to support that recommendation, correct?
That recommendation comes from discussions with the author of the lead author of the paper, and his providing me with the error bounds, the variance of their initial estimate, from which I determined that 11,030 CFS was the upper error bound. And
Okay, that's helpful. And
yeah,
sorry.
and as you'll note in my rebuttal testimony, the 11,030 CFS comes from the error bounds in the study, but CDFW in their effects analysis and identifies another source of error not included in the in the Michel et al. Paper because it results from site's actual operations. And so I modified this, revised this proposed requirement in the rebuttal testimony.
Well, if we could go back to the rebuttal testimony of BK 132 and go to page 5. Yeah, right there, lines 11 to 14. And I think this is what you just, if you could scroll a little bit further so we can see. Thank you. I think you just referred to this. On those lines, you state my proposal of a minimum flow threshold below which sites diversions would be prohibited, developed through discussion with the lead author of the underlying scientific study, appropriately accounts for uncertainty around the estimated flow threshold identified in Baykeeper 59. Is that what you were referring to just a moment ago?
Yes, that accounts for the uncertainty from the original paper.
And you have not identified in your testimony here the specific analysis or data that supports how you derived your 11,030 CFS flow recommendation, correct?
I did not describe it in this testimony, no.
And then if we could pull up BK 59, which is the Michel et al. Study. And in this study, do the study authors ever specifically identify 11,030 CFS as a survival threshold?
I don't know that they do, but if you'd like, if it's allowable, I can provide the email exchange that I had with Dr. Michel about this very point.
Yeah, I don't need to see that, but thank you for the offer. If we could go to page 8 of the study. And the heading on the left column that says spring pulse flow scenarios. Starting with the second sentence, the authors state, we generated 2 hypothetical implementations of pulse flows during the spring period for the study years 2013 to 19. The first implementation scenario allowed for sustained flows that would result in the highest survival rates based on the nonlinear flow survival relationship. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we go to page 12 of the study, and if we could scroll down to just maybe show the whole page. Would you agree that that figure 7 illustrates the different pulse flow scenarios that the authors explored?
I'll have to read the caption here. This was not part of my rebuttal testimony, so it's been a while. Can you continue scrolling down so I can capture the rest of the caption? I think the caption might go on to the next page. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so can you repeat your question?
Well, yeah, now that we're oriented with that figure, and maybe we could scroll back up to the first few, show the first few years, or as many years as you can get in the. In the graphs included in figure 7, can you identify what flow value is shown by the highest horizontal lines?
Not with any precision from these graphs, but I would assume that they are the 10,000 plus level that they identify in the text.
And then if we go to page 11 of the study, at the top of the page, and this is in the right-hand column, the second sentence, the authors identified an optimal threshold of 712 CFS. Is that correct?
That's what it says.
Okay, if we could go to back to Dr. Rosenfield's rebuttal testimony at BK 132. And page 6, we could scroll there to lines 3 and 4. Here you state that the operations ITP does not include a buffer to account for flow attenuation and travel time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then on line 5, you assert that additional flow of 250 CFS is needed to provide this buffer. Is that correct?
That's what the ITP identifies.
If we could pull up Sites 300, which is the effects analysis attachment to the ITP, and go to page 326 at the bottom. That's right. Here at the bottom, and I'm looking at the second to last sentence there. CDFW states that accounting for attenuation and downstream travel time, diversions at Hamilton City and Red Bluff result in reductions of up to 200 CFS for 72 hours after diversions have ceased. Is that correct?
I think you said 200 CFS, but what I see
I'm
on
sorry,
is
250 CFS, yeah.
Yes, 250, correct.
And then it goes on to state that, and this is in the second to last line starting, CDFW reassessed simulated diversions from the ITP application using the 3-day forecasted flow at Wilkins Slough, finding that it would significantly reduce the risk of project operations, reducing river conditions below the higher 50% survival threshold for Chinook salmon migration. Do you see that?
I only see part of that. If we could have the rest on the screen.
Yeah, if we could scroll on to the next page.
Yes. It says CDFW reassessed the simulated diversions. My point is that and found that you had to average using a 3-day forecasted flow to eliminate the effect mentioned in the previous sentence, where the travel time and flow attenuation could result in reductions of up to 250 CFS for 72 hours. So they reassessed the flows using a 3-day forecast window, but they did not require anything like that in the ITP. So they're finding that in a real-time situation, in actual management, the 10,700 CFS flow restriction, as it would be operated, could result in flows 250 CFS lower than required for 72 hours after diversions had ceased. That would be below the 10,700 CFS flow threshold, which is already not the 10,712 CFS flow threshold that Michelle et al. Identified, and certainly doesn't account for the variance around that estimate. So I'm saying that this is an additional source of error that needs to, or quote, error, variance that needs to be accounted for in the actual operation of sites diversions in order to maintain flows above the actual threshold at which fish receive a benefit to survival. Because according to the way that flow is described in the research that CDFW relied on, flows below that threshold, which is above 10,700 CFS, do not provide any benefit at all. And it's only flows above that threshold that result in the survival benefit. So anytime flows drop below 10,700, whatever is identified in the paper, or the actual flow threshold, which might be higher than that because of variance in the estimate, the fish are not going to receive any benefit or protection.
Well, are you aware that the operations ITP condition of approval 9.12 for the Wilkins Slough bypass flow criteria includes certain forecasted flow requirements that preclude the sites project from diverting when those forecasted flows decline below 10,930 CFS?
I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware that the operations ITP condition of approval 9.15 also requires cessation of diversions when forecasts indicate flows will no longer exceed 10,930 CFS?
Perhaps we can look at both of those.
Yeah, we can pull up, this is in sites 298, page 44. And if we could scroll down to show 9.12, I think we can fit that on the screen. Yeah, the last 4 bullet points in 9.12 are what I was referring to as with regard to the forecasted flow limitations. Is this the first that you've reviewed this condition of approval?
Which document? We're in 298.
This is the operations ITP.
Yeah, I've reviewed this, but it's been a while, so I need to refresh my memory. Okay, I've reviewed it. Your question?
Well, my question was whether you were aware of these requirements in the ITP condition of approval, and I think you indicated you were not aware.
Yeah.
And then we can also show 9.15, which is on page 9. Wait, I think it's 49, sorry. And if you could scroll up, I'm sorry, Ms. Mullen, to the prior page, just so we can get the context of. So this is cessation of diversions at Red Bluff Pumping Plant in Hamilton City. And then the first two bullet points on the next page. Well, actually, let's go up to the last bullet point on the prior page first. Were you aware that diversions are required to cease anytime that the measured flows at the Wilkins Sluice Station no longer exceed 10,930 CFS?
Well, that I think is part of the issue. First of all, the 10,930 CFS is a lower estimate of the it uses a different estimate of the upper end of the error bound that I think is flawed and thus not as likely to contain the actual flow threshold that is protective of the fish as the 11,000 plus CFS recommendation that I made. And then this second bullet point here says that when flows at Wilkins Slough are less than 10,930 CFS, diversions upstream will stop. But that's the problem, that there's an attenuation. If you just stop it when flows are at 10,930 CFS at Wilkins Slough, that doesn't prevent flows from dropping below that level due to the travel time and attenuation problem that CDFW addressed.
Okay, I'll move to strike the answers or the testimony that is after when I asked whether he was aware that 10,903 30 CFS was in this requirement here. Mr. Busher can redirect if necessary.
Noted, sustained. Or stricken, I guess would be the word.
And if I could go down to the next page. Again, I'm just asking whether you're aware of these other two limitations in the first two bullet points.
I mean, I was aware of the one on the previous page, and I was aware of this text. I find the way that it's worded to be a bit confusing. But I was aware that these requirements were here. And it's possible that I misunderstood their effect.
Okay, if we could go to back to Dr. Rosenfield's rebuttal testimony at BK 132. And page 6, line 19. Here, you state that the operations ITP only, quote, appears to prohibit diversion of water, end quote, when certain Bay Delta plan requirements are modified by a TUCP order. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the footnote addresses why I say appears.
And you cite to CITES 300, the effects analysis for that. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yeah.
In the operations ITP itself, doesn't condition of approval 9.9 unambiguously require that sites, quote, shall not divert water to storage when those certain Bay Delta plan requirements are modified by a TUCP order?
Maybe we could take a look.
Okay, if we could go to 298 again. And go to condition 9.9. I don't seem to have the page here for that. It would be, yeah, thank you. So this is the controlling condition of approval in the actual ITP, and it says permittee shall not divert water to storage with regard to those requirements when modified by a TUCP. Do you see that?
I see that, and that's what I assumed in my rebuttal testimony in that section that you started with.
Well, is there a reason why you didn't just refer to the actual permit term for the requirement instead of raising a question about what appeared to be prohibited?
I was focusing my attention on the effects analysis because those are the effects that I'm qualified to analyze. So I didn't then cross-check it with what it said in 298.
Okay. If we could go back to BK 132, Dr. Rosenfield's testimony. And if we go to pages, start with page 9. And paragraph 24 at the bottom. And if you're able to show, yeah, as it continues, thank you. Here, Dr. Rosenfield, you opine that the operations ITP condition of approval 9.24 fails to avoid or fully mitigate temperature impacts to Chinook salmon smolts from sites reservoir releases to Knight's Landing Ridge Cut to the Yola bypass, because 70 degrees Fahrenheit is above temperatures where significant impacts are observed. Is that correct?
Correct.
Are you aware that the operations ITP condition of approval 9.22 only allows releases at Knight's Landing Ridge Cut to the Yola bypass from August 1 to October 31st?
I don't recall that, no. But there are fish in that section of river during that time.
Okay, I'd like to move on to page 15 of the testimony. And at lines 15 to 20, maybe if we could show that whole paragraph. Here, Dr. Rosenfeld, you assert, quote, Doctors Greenwood and Wilder refused to acknowledge that diversions to sites reservoir could have substantial negative effects on the threatened and endangered species and recreationally or commercially valuable fisheries. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then you cite to the site's hearing transcript volume 8 for this as support starting at page 1961, correct?
Correct.
Do you have a more specific page number or reference to the transcript where Doctors Greenwood and Wilder allegedly refused to acknowledge those effects?
I don't. That was my general impression of their testimony from listening to parts of it and reading the transcript.
Okay, if we could actually pull up transcripts volume 8. And if we could go to page 1961, I think it's PDF 41. And then starting at lines 14 to 25. Here in this location, Doctors Greenwood and Wilder are questioned about whether the primary stressor of the relevant fish species is diversions and lack of freshwater flow. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then on that same page at lines 20 to 21, Dr. Wilder answers, not necessarily. I think it's way more complicated than that, correct?
That's what it says, yep.
And then on page 1962, on the next page, lines 1 to 3, Dr. Greenwood answers, I'm not sure. I think it's potentially a contributing factor, but I'm not sure about being primary, correct?
Correct.
Is this the testimony you were characterizing Dr. Greenwood and Wilder as refusing to acknowledge that diversions to site's reservoir could have substantial negative effects?
This and other places in the testimony, I found their answers to not be very direct. So, so there are probably other places in here that we could go through where they were not willing to state that diversion of flow is a primary stressor on most or all of the native fishes of concern here.
Well, what you had put in your rebuttal testimony was that they refused to acknowledge that the diversions could have substantial and negative effects on the threatened and endangered species and other fisheries of interest. And here the questions really were not posited that way. Isn't that right?
Can we go back to my testimony in the section that you're citing?
Yeah, that was on page 15 of BK 132. Lines 15 to 20.
I found nowhere in Doctors Greenwood and Wilder's written or oral testimony where they acknowledge that sites reservoir diversions could have substantial negative effects on the threatened and endangered fishes and recreational or commercially valuable fisheries supported by the San Francisco estuary watershed.
Well, were they ever specifically asked that specific question? That you posit here in lines 15 to 18.
I think they were asked questions that are close enough that my description here, I will stand by it.
Okay, appreciate you answering our questions. That's all I have. Thank you, Dr. Rosenfield.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchings. I will look to Mr. Soderlund. Do you have questions for Dr. Rosenfield?
I do not have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mendel-Rice.
I also do not have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Mitchell.
I do not have questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. With that, Mr. Busher, do you want a short break to decide whether you want redirect?
Yeah, that's what I was going to request. If we could take till 3 o'clock, if I have any redirect, it will be short.
Okay, great. Let's take a break till 3 o'clock. See you then.
Thank you.
All right, well, I'll start first by looking to our court reporter. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
Ready to go.
Great, thank you. And then we'll see if Mr. Busher is back.
Apologies for the delay.
No problem. Do you have, well, assuming Dr. Rosenfield is with us, do you have a redirect for Dr. Rosenfield?
I'm sorry, my headphones cut out after "do you?"
Do you have redirect for Dr. Rosenfield?
No, I do not.
Okay, great. Then with that, Dr. Rosenfield, thank you so much for joining us once again, and thank you for your testimony, and you are excused.
Thank you.
I'll look to the room. We finished our list of witnesses for today. So I think generally speaking, we'll break. Just as a matter of some housekeeping issues, I would ask all of you to be prepared to make offers of your, I don't think we need to do it today. We should have time tomorrow. We're doing well. But make offers of your rebuttal evidence and as well as the ITP evidence for the authority. I don't think we did that during the ITP portion. And then I will also accept at that time oral objections to evidence. I just want to note them for the record. They can be very brief, just a brief statement of which exhibits and a one-word basis. Or if you prefer, you can send them in writing by email. I just would like to receive them before the offers of that evidence is made into the record. And then we also, before we close our rebuttal portion of the hearing, we need to talk about deadlines for submitting all of those evidentiary objections in writing. Once again, it's just a follow-up to make sure they're in a chart form that we can respond to, and then setting a deadline for responses to evidentiary objections. And then we may have a couple of other things, but I wanted to put that out on your radar so that we're ready to go through those procedural issues tomorrow. Are there other procedural items that we should address today before we break early for the day? Mr. Hitchings.
Yes, thank you. Maybe just for the other procedural issues to think about is just other next steps beyond just the objections as far as deadlines for closing briefs or whether any parties are going to be seeking SIR rebuttal, I guess.
Yep.
And if not, then deadlines for closing briefs. So maybe just under the umbrella of next steps, scheduling issues.
Yes, thank you. That was more articulate than just next. Yeah, I agree. We should talk about both of those things.
And I had one other item. Well, first of all, I just want to make sure that Ms. Moreno is going to be available tomorrow. And I think the order was that it was going to be Mr. King first and then Ms. Moreno, but I don't know if we got a update as to whether there were going to still be any availability issues with Ms. Moreno.
To our knowledge, there's no availability issues, so she's planning on being there in the morning, or being here, or being wherever we are.
On Zoom, yes. Understood. Thank you. I think because it had been presented to me and I indicated this morning, I don't think Mr. King is with us, that we will intend to start with Mr. King and then move to Ms. Moreno after Mr. King. So we'll plan to do that.
And just Mr. King, I guess he's not here, but just for everybody else's benefit, I don't think our cross is going to be very long for him, maybe 30 minutes at most, at least at this point. That's what we're thinking. The other item I wanted to raise was just you had asked some questions about Diamond Valley Reservoir. Ms. Kenzie, I think it was towards the end of the last hearing date when you were presiding, and We have some information to submit on that. My sense was it's probably clearer to just do it in writing. And our plan would be to just send an email to you and with service on the service list, just explaining or providing an answer to your question about Diamond Valley Reservoir and why it wasn't listed in the application materials.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the estimate on Mr. King's Cross. That also reminded me to follow up. My team, you may have already seen this, but my team did attempt to put together a more formatted version of Mr. King's testimony, rebuttal testimony. So that should be available. We retained the, as I understand it from reflection from my team, we retained the original version in the exhibits folder and then saved a second version that includes the correct, I believe it's corrected or updated or something to indicate that it's not the original in the title, although I haven't personally looked at it.
And that is on the AHO FTP site available?
It should be, and I'm looking to my team to confirm this. Mr. Anderson, are you on? Are you able to confirm that? He may not be. We'll follow up with an I'll ask them to follow up with an email just to clarify that. But I know we were able to make a better, for lack of a better term, a better version.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schutz.
Yes, during the course of the rebuttal phase, there was some discussion of the fact that the Sites Authority was working on an updated model run using Calcium 3. And it seems, well, it seems that it would be likely helpful to be able to understand and view the results of that run, because it was referred to as something that was going to answer some questions. But Ms. Forsyth was unclear as to when it might actually be finished. And my understanding was it was kind of behind schedule. As we are considering dates for surrebuttal or briefing or anything else, it would be good information to have about whether the Sites Authority believes it will have that modeling completed and available to the parties in order to consider in their closing briefs, and how the schedule might be affected by that potential release of the modeling information. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what I'll ask on that is if Mr. Hitchings or another representative from the authority can confer with Mr. Schutz. It seems like maybe a conversation that would be best had offline and then report back if there's follow-up. But hopefully you can actually discuss maybe today, because if you know the answer, because we'd like to talk about it. At least initially to talk about next steps, as we're generally calling it, tomorrow. Although I don't think I'll make a decision about next steps tomorrow. So,
right, I don't think it's something that I need particular information about, or that I need to see in particular. But I just think it was represented as being sort of a definitive answer. We have a number of model runs and model output out there, and my understanding from Ms. Forsyth was that was sort of what they were looking at as something that hadn't been completed yet, and that might be informative to all the parties. So perhaps if we had an update, at least tomorrow when we're discussing the schedule, that would be helpful. I'm not sure there's anything in particular that would benefit me or Mr. Hitchings from a two-way discussion.
Understood. Mr. Hitchings, would you like to respond?
All I know is that it's not ready, and I'll try to get additional information before tomorrow on if there's any estimate as to timing on that.
Great, thank you. And I did, just to circle back, I have confirmation from my team that a corrected King 84 is up on the FTP site, so you should be able to find it there. Mr. Busher.
Yeah, two things for Ms. Moreno's testimony tomorrow. I was curious, Mr. Hitchings, is give or take an hour still a reasonable estimate, or has that changed since we got that update, last week?
Yeah, our estimate is no more than an hour.
And it sounds like we'll be relatively brief with Mr. King. I want to try and give her enough, right, as concrete a time as I can. I think we can plan that she would start at 9:45 or 10 o'clock and then be done before lunch, but I just wanted to make sure I'm thinking about time properly for her testimony, and that works for you, Mr. Hitchings, or Mr. Ferguson, whoever's doing the examination.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good estimate, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mendel-Rice.
Another modeling issue. Back in the case in chief portion of the Central Delta and South Delta parties case in chief, we had asked for modeling results from modeling runs that Mr. Burke had done to support his testimony. I don't have any record of ever receiving those. We asked again last week during Mr. Burke's rebuttal portion about those modeling runs, but it would be great if Central Delta and South Delta could provide those in a somewhat timely manner.
Understood. Mr. Reese, if you're on, my view is strange right now.
Yes.
Do you have a response? Thank you.
Yes, I thought we had provided those a long time ago, and I wasn't here last week, but I will, I'll check with Mr. Burke and get them. I might recall some issue where he sent them to me, but I couldn't get them to. I'll look into it right away and see what the problem was. I think it was a server capacity or some issue of that nature. But...
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Is there anything else we should address before we break until tomorrow morning? All right, with that, thank you very much. I appreciate all of your time. We're adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you.